Good afternoon, and welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Dr. Joseph Sani. I'm the Vice President for the Africa Center at the Institute. The United States Institute of Peace was established by the U.S. Congress in 1984 as a national, nonpartisan public institution dedicated to helping prevent, resolve, and mitigate conflict around the world. In Africa, we focus on mitigating the adverse effects of global powers and middle power competition. Also, we focus on addressing fragility, different drivers of fragility, such as political instability, violence, extremism, misinformation and disinformation, and also to strengthen peace builders, networks of peace builders, regional and local peace architectures. We are gathered today to launch the USIP's newly published report, China's Space Collaboration with Africa, Implications and Recommendations for the United States. But you may wonder, why having this discussion at the US Institute of Peace? We will think that we may have the discussion at the United States Space Study or something. Why the United States Institute of Peace? Space exploration and the pursuit of ambitious space programs have been a significant part of the global agenda for various countries. As great powers vie for dominance in space, the risk of conflict between them looms large. Space programs play a crucial role in ensuring national security and strategic capabilities. Accordingly, the inability or failure to keep up with other great powers may be perceived as a threat to a nation's influence and geopolitical standing. In an environment where space assets are essential for intelligence gathering, communication, and military operation, disparities in capabilities could heighten tensions and create an atmosphere conducive to conflict. Space programs require substantial cooperation and information sharing between nations. However, as competition intensifies, the trust and willingness to cooperate may diminish. Misunderstandings, miscommunication, or deliberate disruptions in communication systems could easily escalate into full-blown conflict. The absence of effective channels for dialogue and de-escalation only exacerbates the risk inherent in space programs. But gone are the days where space programs were only developed by few great powers. A new normal is emerging in space exploration and technological development, one where space programs are recognized as essential component of both economic growth and national security architectures in nations across the world, even in the global south. Since the start of the 21st century, numerous African countries have invested in the development of their space programs as a function of broader development and security goals. Today, space programs exist in over 20 African countries and are rapidly growing in number and investment rates. Several countries are in the process of developing their first satellites in Africa. Many of these African space programs are receiving funding from the Chinese government and work in collaboration with Chinese state-owned enterprises. China pushes space collaboration in Africa in a very intentional way by allocating funds and identifying areas of existing African prioritizations like climate change and counterterrorism efforts for focused satellite development collaboration. While U.S. private and public institutions do collaborate with African countries in the space industry and program development, these efforts are not coordinated throughout current U.S. foreign policy. As the U.S. strategizes ways to deepen collaboration with African partners, it is important to understand why countries are choosing to partner with China. Now, our panelists will introduce the report and dive into its implication for the US, African partners, and the space industry. After the initial panel discussion, we invite you to ask questions via the online chat box for those who are following us online, and for those in the room, just to raise your hands, and that will be easy. My colleague, Henry Tugendhat, will introduce today's panelists, and thank you for listening. My mistake.
No. You're fine. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today's event will be moderated by Henry Tugendhat, an economist with the China team here at USIP. Tugendhat focuses on issues related to China's impact on conflict dynamics in Africa and Latin America. Prior to USIP, Tugendhat worked at the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom, the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, and the World Bank Group's Macroeconomics Trade and Investment team. He is currently finishing his PhD at Johns Hopkins University. Our report writers, Julie Klinger, and online we have Temidayo Oniosun, will be joining us on our panel. Julie Klinger is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware and faculty in the Minerals, Materials, and Society program. Dr. Klinger's research focuses on the dynamics of global resource frontiers and space-based technologies, with particular emphasis in China, Brazil, and the United States. She has published numerous articles on rare earth elements, natural resource use, environmental politics, and outer space. Klinger holds a PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley. Temidayo Oniosun is the founder and managing director of Space in Africa, the leading analytics and consulting company shaping the future of African space and the satellite industry. Prior to founding Space in Africa, he was the African Regional Coordinator for the Space Generation Advisory Council. He advises governments and commercial space players in the industry value chain, and just recently led an African Union Commission baseline study on the socioeconomic benefits for the establishment and operationalization of the African Space Agency. Temidayo is a 2021 Forbes Africa 30 Under 30 award recipient and is a current PhD candidate at the University of Delaware. We would also like to welcome two panelists who will be joining us to discuss the implications of this important report today. Brian Whedon is the Director of Program Planning for the Secure World Foundation and has more than 20 years of professional experience in space operations and policy. He is a former member and chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Future of Space Technologies and the former executive director of the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations. Prior to joining Secure World Foundation, Dr. Whedon served 9 years as an active duty officer in the United States Air Force, where he worked in space and intercontinental ballistic missile operations. Dr. Whedon holds a PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University in the field of science and technology policy. Finally, last but not least, we have Kunshin Lin, who is a professor of military and security studies at the Department of Space Power at the Air University, and is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies. His current research focuses on great power competition in the space domain and in industrial policies of Asian superpowers. Prior to his current roles, he was a university lecturer at the Gonville and Caius College and directed the Center for Rising Powers and the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. He was also a postdoctoral fellow in contemporary Chinese studies at the University of Oxford and taught at King's College London and at the National University of Singapore. Kunshin received his PhD and MA both in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you, and I now turn it over to Henry Tugendhat.
Thank you, and if I may, am I on? Can you hear me? And if I may also briefly thank and introduce Lindsay Tsering, who is a program specialist on our China team, focusing on China, Taiwan, and China-Africa issues. Well, look, I'm going to hand it straight over to Julie and Temidayo to present their research and hopefully give us a succinct overview of everything you found, why it matters, and where we go from here on your report, and then we're going to move down the line and go to Brian and Professor Lin. So I'll hand it straight over to you. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much, Henry. So in a couple minutes, We'll give you a whirlwind tour of our research. But first, I want to say thank you to Henry and the USIP for having us here and for fostering this kind of policy-engaged research. So just a couple of broad strokes. One of the things that really is motivating this research is a long-standing concern with the lack of appreciation for the dynamism of the global space sector. And we find this to be quite troubling, given that the infrastructure of outer space is essential to the infrastructure of everyday life. Right, so everyday life as we know it, whether we're talking about trade or communications or entertainment, relies on space-linked infrastructure. Vital infrastructure, such as public utilities, for example, also relies on, and it's increasingly integrated with, space-linked and space-based infrastructure. And so this makes the domain of outer space inseparable from our standard or perhaps more familiar security concerns. And so given this, talking about and increasing the appreciation of the possibilities for peace and for peaceful collaboration in the space domain, we think is especially important. So it's been a pleasure to work with Tamadao on this report because we bring together two very different backgrounds to what we hope in this report can answer some persistent areas of uncertainty. So my own background is deeply rooted in several years of in-depth and long-term research in China and looking at China's overseas activities more broadly. Temadao's expertise, he's at the forefront of the development of the space sector on the continent of Africa. And so by our powers combined and with our multiple linguistic and cultural interests and ties, we are very much invested in the world and particularly the US government getting this right. Right? So we understand also that this is a really challenging moment to be talking about space cooperation when we have the militarization of outer space that just seems to be running away. Right? So from the establishment of the United States Space Force to, of course, the related or complementary or reactive efforts that have occurred since then. And of course, even before the establishment of the US Space Force, there were, of course, anti-satellite missile tests and various efforts to various shows of force and capability that were occurring around the world. And all of these things fundamentally undermine outer space as the peaceful domain, the peaceful province of all humankind. And in fact, it is that status of outer space as the peaceful province of all humankind that has enabled the development of modern life as we know it. I mean, think about it. We're talking in this report about satellite cooperation especially. But let's think for a moment about what a satellite is, right? A satellite is a very delicate and very expensive piece of technology that is a culmination of human scientific effort and achievement. And the fact that any country in the world, and in fact, many business entities, research entities, and what have you, have the confidence in the order of the international system to place these very delicate and expensive pieces of technology in orbit has been fundamental for so many of the conveniences that make modern life work. And also, these things are fundamental for achieving various socioeconomic and development goals. So with the big picture here, the other thing that I will say, and I'm not going to repeat the report in its entirety because you can read it at your leisure, but the other thing that I want to say is just to kind of sensitize the audience to the dynamics of China's space program. So we live in a time of intensifying tension between the US and China, and oversimplifications are rife, right? And so if there's anything that I can offer the audience today, I'd like to give you a picture or a conceptual framework that helps you understand China's space sector and space industry. And then I'll hand it over to Tamadao to say a few words about the dynamism and trends in Africa's space sector. So the first thing, I'll actually start with the US. The space sector, the space industry in the US is dynamic. It is hybrid. You have your civilian, your military, and your private sector components. And depending on the project, depending on the policy mandate, they all do or don't work together, right? And then, of course, you have the proliferation of private sector entities, service providers, and a lot of innovation and activity happening in this space. You also, in this context, have a situation where not everyone knows what everyone else is doing, right? There are sometimes surprises. There are sometimes accidents. People sometimes step on people's toes. I think that the same can be said for China's space industry. Right? China, of course, has its flagship National Space Agency, CNSA, China National Space Agency, but they work with a number of state-owned enterprises and private firms, and a whole chain of subcontractors that are doing their best to cash in on the growth of the space sector. And this includes forging international partnerships, including with counterparts in Africa. So I don't want to go over time here, but I'll turn it over to Temadayo to offer some comments to the public on the dynamism and growth of Africa's space sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klinger. Generally, space program is growing in Africa, and space has now been identified as a critical tool to help shape the future of Africa. And this is evident in the African Union Commission Agenda 2063, which laid out the plans and goals for building and developing the Africa that we all want. There's an increasing business opportunities in the industry. We're also seeing a lot of advancements in space technologies in Africa, emergence of a lot of commercial companies that are building critical space infrastructure. In addition, space has become a critical tool for diplomacy with African countries. And space is helping to solve some of Africa's critical problems, from agriculture to security to disaster management and monitoring to urban development. In addition, several nations are now working closely with Africa to help develop its space program. And in recent years, China has emerged as the leading partner for Africa. We're seeing a lot of collaborations across all industry segments, including communications, Earth observation, navigation and positioning, as well as space science. Finally, this current dispensation is the beginning of the future for space program development in Africa. And right now, China is well positioned to help shape that future.
Thank you very much. Well, that was very succinct. Well, I think what you've raised in this report and more generally in your remarks is how much of these developments are really being driven by African actors themselves, and how this is a very pivotal moment for the development of this technology, because there is so much demand for cooperation, there is so much demand for collaboration on the development of these technologies, but also the sharing of knowledge and technology and information itself. And I think what you're really achieving in this report is pointing out the gaps that the US could and should be filling. But of course, you're also highlighting an aspect of this developing technology that many people are not familiar with, which is that China is actually becoming somewhat of a leader in this space on the African continent. And I'm curious, Temadayo, if I could start with you when we get to the Q&A, if you could tell us a little bit more about what that looks like from the continent. But before we get into questions and answers, I'm going to hand it straight over to Dr. Whedon to share some reflections on what we've heard so far.
Thank you for that. And again, I want to commend the authors on the report. I think it was excellent. To me, it is very unique in this field. I'm not aware of similar research, and I think it really adds a lot of value to those that are looking at these kinds of problems. So my organization, the Secure Foundation, our focus is twofold. On the one hand, we are focused on how do we use space for all the benefits we've all been talking about, and the ways that we can use space applications to help improve our daily lives, improve global society. But at the same time, how do we address the potential long-term sustainability of using space? As was mentioned, there's a lot more countries getting involved in space. There's a lot more activity, many more satellites that are being put up. Just as a raw number, 10 years ago, there was something on the order of 115 or so satellites put into orbit. Just last year, there were nearly 2,500 satellites put into orbit. Radical increase. And the projected growth curves are even higher. Now, we're seeing lots more benefits, but the question is, how do we deal with some of those challenges? And so that is something that I think we're trying to grapple with, and then you add into the geopolitics of not only this growing tension between the US and China, and let's not forget Russia, that's a little bit outside of the conversations for today, and how do you have just these broader international collaborations to be able to set the framework so that we can all use space like we all would like to be able to use into the future. I think one of the things that struck me reading through the report is what a different future this means for the way the US has approached this issue of space collaboration historically. Historically, if you talk to somebody at NASA or this government, they would say, well, we're going to collaborate in space with countries and in ways that provide benefits to us, that bring a technology or bring funding or bring something to this program we have, whether it's the shuttle program or the space station or some remote sensing satellite. And it was very focused on, we're going to do this for this substantive benefit. And I think that has led the US to, frankly, ignore large parts of the world that could have been good opportunities to collaborate. And now we've seen other countries, Europe, but especially China, sort of fill in those gaps. And in some ways either identify that there was a gap there to be filled, or just have a different approach to collaboration. And that then, of course, has sparked this response in the US by saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? And in some ways, part of me tends to say, well, I mean, did you not see this coming, right? But at the same time, there is still a serious issue here. And I am heartened in some ways by seeing there has been a shift underway in the way the United States is approaching some of these questions of space collaboration and partnership and cooperation. But it's a slow change. And so I think this report is going to help identify some areas where there can be a bigger shift towards more concrete changes and some concrete goals that are going to benefit both the United States and Africa, and hopefully better parts of the world. So I'll stop there, and I know we've got a lot of the questions I want to get to throughout the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Wing. Dr. Lin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that my predecessors have been very succinct to offer a slightly longer version of my briefing, if that's all right. Yeah, but thank you for inviting me here. I also want to just state that my views do not reflect that of the U.S. Space Force. I think the report has offered a very compelling diagnosis that space technology has not been a focus of U.S. policy in Africa. It needs to be, right? So I guess my feedback is to try to push the report further by asking the next questions to follow. And I think this report needs to be duplicated for Latin America, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. That's certainly a logical extension of this significance of the report. And one way that I've thought about this issue is to think about, and I think Timoteo asked about this question earlier, is, the report states very clear that African countries have many options at this point, right? It's not just, oh, we recognize there's a need, we're going to step in and do our hegemonic thing, right? But then we also need to recognize that it's not a question of zero-sum game here, and it's not that we're countering China in some ways. It's more of an issue of, and I tell my students this all the time, is that we have to think about what if China were to succeed in its aspirations, or if it becomes a major player in the space industry in Africa. At the same time, we need to ask the question, what if China were to fail as a space player, right? So a lot of projects do not come to fruition. And oftentimes in developmental history, we in the West, institutions, governments, end up having to intervene or to help countries recover from the consequences of that. So to think in that direction, I think one thing that's really important, there are two aspects I thought sort of was emerging from the report and could be extended further in future research. One is to really be specific about what kinds of effects are we expecting from this growth industry. The economic spillover effects and the synergistic effects, as the report posits, are exactly that. They are hypothesized. And it's not entirely demonstrated. And of course, this has to do with longer term research. But the question is, how do we expect these projects to play out over time? And the second aspect, which is related to the first, is what are the opportunity costs of using US State Department, USAID, US DoD resources to focus on space industries instead of other purposes and tasks? And I think to determine the second one, which is a sort of first step towards strategy, is to think about, to have some initial assessments as to how these things are going to play out. And so to that, I think the report has a few points which are very well worth developing. One is there's a very clear recognition that China does not, repeat, not dominate across the board, right? So this really depends on this unfolding value chain of the space industry, right? There are many points. Launch market is competitive, and as a member of US Space Force, we're certainly pushing for our launch capabilities over the next few years. Space manufacturing is also very competitive. I understand that space, satellites are delicate instruments, but frankly, it's not a high-tech instrument, right? Many countries can produce satellites. I have college students in Pennsylvania who are producing them in their own backyards. So it's a matter of where are we competing on this chain. Then there's the second point, is the impact of Chinese investment operations remain to be studied. And so the report focuses a lot on data pooling implications, right? We have Earth observation, we have Beidou navigation system, we have climate change mitigation usages. So it will be very interesting to get an insight into, for example, the terms of the contract, right? If we're positing ourselves, the Americans, as the one to offer shared information, open architecture, what exactly are the Chinese being restrictive about, and what are they steering these contracts towards? That will be interesting. Second is that as the space industry develops, one of the most important things is space-enabled services, right? So we talk about training of engineers and operators, Beidou centers in some countries, military operations, domain awareness, security apparatus training, all these sort of subsequent products are hugely important. And one of the interesting idea in the report is that the Chinese offer this bundling of resources, right? Both finance, production, services, and everything else. And the idea is that somehow that would tend to be synergistic. But from our understanding of other fields, other products, that is not necessarily the case. So what I'd like to point to is the example on solar panels. For the purpose of the report, I tried to actually look up my literature. And there's obviously not a lot written, and hence the value of the report. But one thing that's been fairly well studied is the attempt to start solar panel industries in South Africa and other African countries. And this is one of these examples of high-tech sector, which is capital intensive, at least the startup cost. It's got very limited employment opportunities. So if you're looking at sustainability and opportunities for local population, it's not necessarily the industry you'll invest in. It's got sort of limited social economic, benefits for broader population. It's got very marginal developmental, input. So these are some of the limitations of an industry like the space manufacturing as well as solar panels. So that's sort of the basis for comparison. And if you do look at that, the reports show that, not this particular report, but all the studies on solar panel shows very limited impact in terms of developmental and environmental for African countries that have launched these projects. And there are many reasons for that, right? And some of the reasons is regulatory, right? For example, in South Africa, they don't have very good local content requirements. And even though when they put in local content requirements, Chinese firms through transfer pricing, other mechanisms tend to bolster that, but not actually delivering the benefits. There are also issues with the market being limited. You have very limited capability in terms of technology and in terms of consumption. So the market itself is necessarily externally oriented. What usually works is that if you can start small manufacturing firms and then train people in larger firms, but that's a tall order. So what we're looking at, and I think this is the key thing, is that Africa has experienced so many waves of promises of development. Technology-driven sometimes, otherwise it's industrial policy, trade policy. And the question is, how is the space industry different than the previous waves? How can we make it different through U.S. support? We do not want a new dependencia, sort of dynamic happening. And this is something that perhaps would be expected because in the past, in the Cold War period, space industries joined space clubs precisely because they got particular support from either Soviet Union or United States. Is that going to repeat itself? Right? Are we going to see African countries which essentially do not have clear comparative advantage to space manufacturing, then sort of being attractive at this time due to their geographic location, rare earth minerals, potential contribution to a network effect for Chinese architecture in terms of digital space and communications. But what happens when these effects disappear? Right? What happens when India and Malaysia are producing the same things? Do we then see a round of protectionism? Do we see countries locked into a lower end sort of industrialization process, which has been seen before, right? Just focusing on what they have resource-wise, but not so much promoting the upgrade. So I guess the question is then, does the report suggest ways that the US can make a difference when some of these dynamics begin to kick in? And just to conclude, I do see at least a couple of things we can add in terms of recommendation. One is that, and this is harking back to an area I know more about, which is East Asia. For example, we have Japan, right, which is taking a lead in the Asian space industry by promoting certification and standard setting capabilities for the regional players. And this is something that we can think about adding to the list of excellent recommendations in the report, is that we can find a partner, a center that perhaps we could help to develop trade policy, standard setting, regulations, these soft power capabilities, so that regardless of the partner involved, the African countries will be better in managing these developmental effects. Second, I think there needs to be an interagency process going, right, between the state, DoD, and various other agencies, because a lot of capabilities are coming online, but what are we offering to our partner is not always coherent. And lastly, we need to think about this interesting thing about, and the report clearly shows that China has these sort of cluster of state-owned enterprises and private actors and subcontractors that go into every project. Well, given the fact that the report points out that Africa constitutes 0.7% of global space expenditure, it's not going to be a big priority for SpaceX. How do we then motivate our firms to enter into these markets, perhaps through the certification programs I mentioned that will reduce the transaction cost for engagement? So these are some of the things I think the report points us towards, and we should certainly develop further. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those reflections. Well, I think we should start by handing back to Temideo and Julie just to reflect on some of that feedback, and then we'll open it up to questions in the room and online. If anybody has any questions, please start submitting, and we'll start gathering those up. But I'll start with Julie and Temideo.
Okay, excellent. Did you want to have Temideo address the question that you put out initially?
Sure, yeah, actually, Temideo, if you could also speak a little bit more to the what the considerations are for African space agencies, either as individual agencies or in terms of the multilateral collaborations that currently exist when choosing international partners, and how it's come to pass that China has become such a significant player in this space.
Okay, thank you very much. So to talk a little bit about your first question on what China is specifically doing, there's a lot of work going on around technology development. So developing satellites for different African customers. China has so far built satellites worth close to $900 million for African countries. Beyond satellite development, they're developing a lot of ground station infrastructures They've done this for Ethiopia, Nigeria, Algeria, just to mention a few countries. There's also a lot of space program financing as well as technology financing. So providing loans, for satellites. And we've also seen cases of, China actually gifting satellites to an African nation. Beyond these, we're seeing a lot of push for the adoption of Beidou navigation and positioning services, as well as a lot of space applications projects, where, through the ground stations that they're installing for African countries, they're able to, provide free satellite data from either Chinese government satellites or satellites that belongs to specific organizations that China is part of. Providing this data for like different African customers, and to respond a little bit to what Professor Lee's comment on the specific effect of China's collaboration with Africa in the U.S. context. I think there are multiple ways to look at this. So first is let's not look at this as just the U.S. government. We can look at this from the perspective of U.S. commercial space institutions also. So take for example, I think Africa offers a decent business opportunity for global space companies, and we're already seeing a lot of global space companies doing a lot of business in Africa. And it's also evident that a lot of not just US, I think a lot of global space companies are currently struggling. We've seen several companies that went public in like the US, for example, ViaSpat, currently struggling. A few of them have had to declare bankruptcy. So there is a lot of business opportunities in Africa, and Chinese companies have been capitalizing on this for several years, and it's now that the U.S. U.S. companies they're waking up to this reality. Yes, the U.S. Space industry is the largest in the world, but for specific companies, especially those operating in the downstream segments, selling data services, or even those selling communication services, being able to sell these products and services and having a chunk of the African markets could actually help a lot of them to stay in business. Beyond this, I think now space diplomacy is actually influencing and helping with general diplomacy. So China is saying that one of the ways to come in to build very good relationship with African institutions, not just China, even Europe, is realizing this. One of the ways to build solid relationship with Africa, is to actually come in through space. And this makes a lot of sense, especially because the African governments, African Union, for example, they've specifically identified that, space, this is a critical area, that is a priority to them and that can help them address a lot of the fundamental problems and build the future that they want. And beyond all of this also, for the effect of what China is doing in Africa, in the US context, we're seeing a lot of push for Chinese products and services. A good example of this is the Beidou navigation system that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of devices in Africa globally today are already carrying. They're already being built on this particular infrastructure. China.
Could you tell our audience members what the Beidou satellite navigation system is, just for people who might not already know what it is?
Oh, so this is China's version of the GPS. So of course, GPS is able. GPS is global. Maybe for the next decade or two, no one can actually displace them. But there's a lot of push from the Chinese government to actually push the adoption of Beidou in Africa. In fact, there has been over 14 meetings in the last couple of months between several Chinese institutions and different layers in the African Union Commission to conceptualize projects and programs that would help with the adoption of baby, massive adoption of baby in Africa. So these are, this may not matter so much, but these are some of the things that would eventually affect, U.S. global hegemony. So, a lot of these things may look, they may look irrelevant now, but by the time you combine all of these things together, into the future, this will definitely shape, what is going to happen in the next couple of years. And to answer your, there was a question about, the African Space Agency and, working with different national governments. One of the ways to, there are 54 African countries, and, it may not be realistic to move from one country to another to, figure out ways to work with them. One of the approaches that actually work effectively is working with the African Union Commission to conceptualize projects and programs that can be implemented or that can actually involve if not all of the African countries, but most of the African countries. And this is also perfect because the African Union Commission is the custodian of the African Space Agency. And until the agency becomes fully operational, I think the African Union Commission is a perfect avenue to build some of these critical relationships. And lastly, to respond to the question on how the U.S. can actually make a difference, I think that one of the ways to the U.S. can make a difference is right now there is an opportunity for the U.S. to actually help to shape and promote the use of outer space for peaceful use and for good. So whether it's in, Brian is from Secure World Foundation. There's a lot of conversations around space sustainability now. So maybe this is a point where the U.S. can come in. Taking space sustainability messages globally, because no one is having this conversation on the continent right now. And the second area is there's also opportunity for the U.S. to work with African institutions on areas that actually pertains to both parties. You can work together to address common problems, and this is what we're seeing with cooperation from Europe, for example. So the U.S. Foreign policy towards Africa is mostly around safety and security, political freedom, economic opportunity. And in terms of, security, whether, we're dealing with disaster management or monitoring, or, economic prosperity building, critical ecosystem that can facilitate commerce. I think the U.S. can come in through some of these channels, capitalizing on its global space infrastructure to actually push this. It's not all, cooperation with Africa that is, I understand that, especially, where China is concerned, a lot of conversations around China, it is usually around how China is, for example, taking advantage of African countries. But beyond this, there are ways to work with Africa to capitalize on the resources to, build commerce. And I think one of the things that China is trying to do now that may actually shape the way space program is going to be done in the next decade in Africa is exploring Africa's territory for satellite launches. They're currently talking to Djibouti to set up infrastructures to launch satellites from African soil. And this is an area that no one else is currently paying attention to in Africa. A lot of the African countries on the equator, they provide very good landscape, that can actually support a lot of, whether it's, satellite launches or even, lunar missions. The US is already doing a lot of work with South Africa in capitalizing on its territorial infrastructures to support US mission. So a lot of work can also be done, with other African countries, capitalizing on the continent, infrastructures and geographical locations to support a lot of space mission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Temendayo. Julie, did you want to reflect on some of the opening remarks?
Yes. I'll say, because I know we have questions in the chat and what have you. First, thank you both to Dr. Whedon and Dr. Lin for your remarks and your reflections on the significance on the report and also ways that it could be pushed further. I'll just address one question posed by Dr. Lin, which was, what are the opportunity costs for, say, the Department of State, for example, to focus on space? And what would be, we can think also about what the opportunity costs would be in building interagency coordination around this, moving toward, what Dr. Whedon said is a very different kind of future in terms of how the U.S. engages in space-related activities and space diplomacy. And in a way, that question it resonates with earlier debates around how to engage with the internet, right? Or mobile phone technology, even in that way. I think one of the things that we're seeing with the dynamism in the space domain and also its profound integration with everyday life, hardware, software, hard power, soft power, is the importance of building out the capability to understand how different actors and entities engage through space-based and space-linked technologies, much in the same way that it's been crucial to understand how different actors and entities engage via cyber technologies, for example. And so I'll just say, in the interest of time, I'll just say that, but to if you'll allow me to, instead of actually answering your question directly, to put it in the perspective of earlier iterations of this tech and policy question.
Thank you. Well, we've already got some questions online. If there are any questions in the room, please put your hand up, but I'll start with what I've got here. To what extent do you see cases like Spatial Lejano space station in Argentina as instructive for African countries engaging with China on space programming? I have to admit that I'm reading this verbatim because I myself do not know what this Spatial Lejano example refers to. So please tell us what that refers to in the context of your answer. And then how can the US strategically align its space-related engagements as well as provide support for African space programs?
Okay, great, thank you. So the first one, I love this question because it's a comparative question. And I really like it because it's actually how I came to the question of space-related activities on the African continent was actually via my focus on this question in Latin America. Right, and it was the cooperation between Latin American space agencies and African space agencies that ultimately, long story short, led to the research collaboration that you see culminating in this report today. So just a little bit of quick background on the Espacio Lejano. This is a ground receiving station that is part of China's Deep Space Research Network. So there are a number such stations around the world, I think 7 or 8, some in polar regions, some aboard ocean-going vessels. And the case in Argentina is particularly provocative because it is leased to China for a 50-year term, and there is no local oversight mechanism. So it's been critiqued as effectively Argentina handing over a segment of its territory to Chinese sovereignty. And there's been a lot of concern about this ground station being used for other things besides deep space research and observation. In response to which the Chinese counterparts have offered assurances that it's not used for these purposes, but again, there's no oversight mechanism in place. And so that's a case where you have a little pocket of another sovereign country being leased to China for their particular space-related purposes. I think that's instructive if we view it in comparison to, say, the Chinese satellite and ground station contributions in Ethiopia that we talk about in the report. And so this is a very different situation where you have a collaboration between Chinese and Ethiopian counterparts. Again, you have public as well as private sector entities involved here. And one of the outcomes of this agreement was not just the construction of a satellite for Ethiopia, but also the construction of ground receiving stations and capacity building and training for Ethiopian personnel so they can operate it and they can work with their own satellite. Right, so that's two very different approaches. And one of the things to understand also about that is that the case in Argentina is for China's deep space research network. And the case in Ethiopia is built very much with Chinese support and collaboration for Ethiopia's space agency.
Thank you very much. And I know that you've addressed this in some of your opening remarks already, but if there was anything else you wanted to add on the US's ability to strategically align its space-related engagements or support African space programs, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually to address this, I'll draw on an earlier discussion and some insights offered by Temadayo. I mean, one of the issues here is that the U.S. does not have a sort of clear strategy for engaging with African counterparts in the space domain. And this is in contrast to China, to the European community, and to Russia, right? They have dedicated personnel, dedicated plans that are about specifically engagement with Africa and space. And so that's one thing. And so there's not a kind of, the US doesn't have a clear strategy or a peer strategy to these other programs. And the other observation is that US engagement with Africa with respect to outer space is quite transparently reactive, right, in response to China's moves in this foray. And so this is pretty transparent. And it also, the fact that it's reactive is, again, underscores the lack of careful engagement with the African Union Commission, a lack of engagement with individual African countries in order to really understand how both sides can benefit, right? Really underscoring the points that Temadayo has offered us earlier.
Thank you. Temadayo, did you want to jump in on any of this?
Yes. So just to add to the last comment, talking about lack of clear strategy. You see, a good example of this is last December there was the U.S. Africa Space Forum in DC, and there was a lot of conversation there on how the U.S. will work with Africa, but nothing concrete came out of that except two countries signed the Economist Accord. And last month there was another event that was organized in Baku, and a lot of African counterparts were invited again to discuss this the same issue. But the problem is nothing is actually coming out of all of this conversation, and it's already getting to the point where African leaders are beginning to see engagements with the U.S. as a waste of time. Because when you have similar meeting with the European Commission, for example, one held in Dakar last month, the meetings are very clear. There are clear objectives, there are clear strategies. Either new programs are being announced or clear deliberations are happening on where the two regions are going to come together to work together. There's clarity in all of this conversation. It's usually a clear outcome. Engagement with the US, has not yielded any result. And it's beginning to seem like, for a lot of leaders, it's possible that when future meetings are called like that, they may not show up because there's a lack of strategy. So I think for future engagement, it's very critical for the US government to work on this.
Thank you very much. Well, we're coming up to time soon, but I do want to take the opportunity to bring Dr. Lin and Dr. Whedon into this conversation a bit. Firstly, if you have any reflections on anything that's been said, but more specifically, Dr. Lin, you spoke about the concern around space clubs as they existed in the Cold War and how this might be growing. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on either how we might avoid that if that needs to be avoided, or indeed areas where there are perhaps even overlapping interests between the US and China or any foreign counterparts over the developments of this technology. And Dr. Whedon, I'm curious, given your own background and expertise, whether you have any insights on why the US has been lacking in this relationship with Africa when it matters so much. Well, I'll start with Dr. Lin.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start off with, in response to Tamadeo's last point, is that in referencing us to European countries, I mean, if you were to read the strategies of Britain or France on space strategies, they're very clearly geared to commercial gains. And this is something that we do not do simply because we have bigger fish to fry. Like we have a bigger stake in a lot of issues. But I think what's really important is that we do need to steer to a geoeconomic understanding of what we can do with African countries that are mutually beneficial. And one of the key things I try to emphasize is that if you look at the space industry, right, in terms of launches last year, 80% was SpaceX, 10% was the Chinese, and then the rest of 10% the rest of the world. And then aerospace industries probably among top 5 in terms of industries that are most susceptible to things like pandemic and logistics disruptions. So we're talking about a very volatile market that seems to be growing but could very easily shrink or consolidate in the near future. What are we doing to sort of provide the market intel and the governance support to try to make this a more accessible market for Africa and for countries that are interested in making this sustainable and equitable? Right. I think that's the premise that we need to start. Yeah, thank you.
So as to why the U.S. hasn't done this sooner, I think partly keep in mind there's always been 2 parts to the U.S. space program. There was the public-facing, which was NASA and all the space for people, peaceful purposes, all that kind of stuff. But there's always been this national security program that sometimes was bigger than the public program, but was very behind the scenes, either deliberately or just sort of not talked about. And on the national security side, historically, the U.S. has done a very much go-it-alone approach. Even with our close allies, the Five Eyes, that we collaborate with in many other areas, up until very recently, we're not pulled into that for collaboration. So on the whole national security side of things, the U.S. just didn't work with anybody historically on that. On the public-facing, NASA, peaceful purposes, that historically was linked to the Cold War space race, the battle for prestige with the Soviet Union. And there was a strong focus on, big projects that we could use to show off sort of American superiority, and again, prestige and all that sort of stuff. And then that shifted to how do we sustain these things with things like the shuttle program and the International Space Station, where the U.S. is bringing in partners that could contribute significantly to those projects, that had countries like Russia and Canada and others that had technology of their own to contribute to the program. There just wasn't this vision of a broader strategy of how to bring in more countries. So I think that is changing. I think that there's recognition that needs to change, but it is going to take a while for this government to kind of build in this new, not only this new mentality, but just the capacity to go off and collaborate with a broader set of countries in different ways than they have in the past.
Thank you very much. Well, look, I'm going to finish with one closing question for the panel at large, and then please throw in any closing remarks you'd like to make. But the final question is, to what extent should we be concerned about the dual-use applications of these satellites and technologies that China is developing with African nations?
So I'll quickly start, and I'll just say, I mean, I'm increasingly of the opinion that dual use is not the right way to frame this, because pretty much everything in space has both functions, right? Historically, on this question of weaponization and militarization, the debate multilaterally within the UN has been on banning the placement of space weapons or preventing an arms race in outer space, and a strong focus on things, objects, technologies. That has shifted recently. There has been a shift in the last few years to talking more about behaviors in space, because the behavior is what separates how you use something, right? You can certainly use a car as a weapon if you wanted to, but we all know that it also has a huge amount of purposes that are not related to warfare. So that shift has happened within the context of what was known as this open-ended working group on reducing space threats that the UN held over the last couple of years. What was striking about that conversation is something on the order of 70 countries participated and about 50 made statements, far more than have contributed in the past to similar discussions on these topics in the UN. So that process concluded earlier this year. UNGA just voted to have a follow-up discussion starting in 2025 on this further discussion of norms and these behaviors. So I think that's where things are going to go. To me, that is a more productive discussion than trying to delineate what technologies are dual use or military only or that sort of thing.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree with you, Brian. Just to add a secondary point is going back to Professor Deborah Brottingham's earlier study about sort of ports and debt diplomacy in Africa. I think one thing for us to keep in mind is that this dual use needs to be disaggregated. So you need to break it down. Are we talking about contracts? Are we talking about certain purposes? These effects need to be clarified before we make certain assumptions about what the impact will be on our strategy. So that's yeah.
Thank you.
I'll take the last word.
All right, only a certain. Sorry, Timothy.
I just want to say that the U.S. space strategy towards Africa should not be primarily influenced by what China is doing. Because I think if it is influenced by what China is doing, the U.S. might actually lose the battle.
Thank you.
And building on Brian's excellent point, I mean, this is a dual-use device. This is arguably already militarized. And it's a worst-case scenario that it becomes a weapon, right? And so I think that should help us think about space technology as well. This is a space technology. It is space-integrated, space-linked, probably linked to 5, 6, 7, 8 satellites right now as we speak. And so I think this is a good closing thought for the USIP. I mean, focus on peace on all fronts, peace for its own sake, peace as an end in itself, so the tech isn't weaponized, so the behaviors are good and constructive.
Fabulous. Well, look, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming to attend this. Thank you to everyone online. Thank you especially to my colleagues in the China team and the Africa Center for the collaborations to make this possible, and thank you especially to Lindy Tsering for bringing us all together here today for this report launch. But of course, thank you especially to Temidayo and Julie for this fantastic report, and I hope you'll read it. You can find it on our website, and you can catch up on the beginning of this event. If you missed the beginning, it'll be posted on our webpage through YouTube. So thank you again, and please join me in thanking our discussants.